Hello, and a very warm welcome to everyone joining today's webinar on anxiety and behaviours in Fragile X syndrome, presented by Dr Marcia Braden. My name is Liz Jewell, and I work as the Family Support Counsellor with Fragile X Association Australia. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we are meeting on today and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. If any of the content in this webinar triggers you emotionally and you feel in need of support, please contact either myself or Wendy directly. A special thank you to Zynerba Pharmaceuticals for the educational grant in making this webinar with Marcia Braden possible. Before we begin, also, I would just like to flag a couple of announcements. We have later this month, Fragile X Australia and Fragile X New Zealand will be hosting a two-part series on toileting and Fragile X syndrome with Dr. Jennifer Epstein. Dr. Marcia Braden is a licensed psychologist and a special educator living in the US. Marcia is respected for her work internationally and has presented at numerous conferences and workshops about Fragile X syndrome, autism, and other related disorders. Marcia has literally worked with hundreds of children and adults with Fragile X syndrome. She has written and published countless articles related to educational and behavioural strategies, interventions and techniques relating to Fragile X throughout many, many years. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to hear Marcia Braden present, and without further ado, I would like to hand over to Dr. Marcia Braden.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Today, we're going to talk about anxiety and how it affects behavior. This is a critical element and an important one for those with Fragile X. Most of the behavior that is referred to me and behavioral problems really result from anxiety. Most people with Fragile X exhibit anxiety, and their reaction to different situations in their environment makes them very anxious. So I want to show you a video to start off to kind of paint the picture in terms of this population and what really goes on with them. This is a little guy that's in elementary school. And when we look at this behavior, we may think that this individual is being non-compliant, is trying to avoid work, is just pain in the neck, really hard to teach kind of guy. Well, there's really a lot more to this, and that's why I picked this particular video to show you. He is in a classroom with his peers. He wants to be in that classroom. So we have that sort of approach avoidance paradigm that we have with these individuals. He wants to be there, but it is so incredibly difficult for him to handle. So let's watch this for a little bit to see what he does. So this is the rest of the classroom.
So now, what happens?
And this little guy is back in a corner, and you can actually see that he needs the help of the structure. I'm going to pause this a moment, of the structure behind him to just kind of cuddle him in. He has his legs up, which oftentimes will give a lot more support in terms of co-contraction of muscles. And he's sitting there really wanting to hear what's going on, sort of passive, but he can't bring himself to joining the group. Now, is he purposefully doing this? Is he trying to get away with something or not cooperate or whatever it might be in terms of what people would tag his behavior to be? Absolutely not. He is filled with anxiety. It is so difficult for him to be a part of the group, even though he really wants to be there. So this really captures what I'm going to talk about today and how anxiety affects the lives of individuals with Fragile X syndrome. If we look at anxiety, I'd sort of like to break it up into two different sorts of paradigms or ideas and examples. One is the state anxiety. So state anxiety is one way of looking at it, and it's really the response or the adaptation to a situation. People with Fragile X have both state and trait. So state and trait anxiety are two different things, and I want to talk about that today to let you know how different they are. Trait anxiety really defines the effect of this organism with Fragile X syndrome over time and across a variety of situations. This is really part of the neurobiology of Fragile X syndrome. And those of you that have heard me before often see the picture of the brain and how some of the brain is affected by the lack of protein. And we'll get into that in just a minute, but that's part of this neurobiology. That is trait anxiety. State anxiety, on the other hand, is the response or adaptation to a given situation. And so what that simply means is this person with trait anxiety now has to respond to the state or the environment around them. And those are two things that sort of work against the individual with Fragile X syndrome. People with Fragile X have both state and trait anxiety. You can see it here. I kind of like this example. It's a great way to portray the trait being a consistent sort of, stable sort of trait. And then the state anxiety as being a lot more fluid, meaning that it can change. It can be just really difficult to manage, and it can be something that sort of has to adapt to the environment in different ways. So to kind of understand this all, we need to look at that Fragile X protein and the results of the lack of it on the dendritic spines. That spine density is really a culprit in this whole process because that neurotransmitter activation has to go through this dendritic spine. And that synapse is really an important part of the messaging to the brain when someone is suddenly presented with some state that causes them to be very anxious. This is the trait part. So again, this process right here, you can see there's very little pruning in this dendrite. There's lots of spikes and places for the message to go rather than straight across to the place where it needs to go in the brain. And this is a picture of an unaffected human. This is the dendrite from an unaffected human. You can see that there aren't as many spikes. It's nicely pruned. And so the message can go quickly to the place of the brain where it needs to go. So this really tells about why this is so difficult for these individuals when suddenly they're presented with something that is very anxiety provoking. That message gets lost or maybe even gets highly transmitted. So this is what we're talking about when we look at trait anxiety. It's the lack of that messenger protein, that Fragile X protein. And what it does is it results in a huge abundance or overabundance even in the proper neural connections. In this case, we're going to talk a lot about that amygdala and this area right here, because that's the area of the brain that really looks at or really deals with the anxiety. So again, that's something that you're going to hear me talk a lot about in this lecture. So the neurobiology is there. That's real. We can't, again, and when you go back to the video of the little guy in the corner there that's perched himself in the corner, that is not a behavior that he wants to have. It's nothing that he's doing to manipulate the environment or the teacher or anyone else. It is truly a part of his brain. This neurobiology has this piece of the connection strengthened in the amygdala. That's where the anxiety component is. That's where all of our anxiety is in our brain. But it's overabundant in this population. Remember, that spine, that dendritic spine, it's overabundant and it creates more anxiety than you would see in the typical neurotypical environment. And it's trait-based. Remember, it's a trait. It's part of Fragile X syndrome. Now, let's talk about state for a minute. We've kind of looked in the neurobiology of trait anxiety, but let's look at state anxiety because that is one part of this particular concept that you have some control over as caregivers, parents, and teachers. State anxiety is the response or adaptation that this individual has to a certain situation. Now, I bet you can think about this right now, and you think about the person with Fragile X that you're part of their lives. You can think of many situations where this individual had to adapt to a very difficult situation, a difficult environment, a fire drill, a loud noise, a change of a schedule. There are so many of those. And this person has to now respond or adapt to that change, to that anxiety-provoking situation. So here are some of the ones that we can list, and you certainly can add more to this. Dealing with a novel situation. This is critical. Those of you that have people that you care for, people in your family, children, etc., adults, this is for sure something that we're going to have to deal with, right? The novel situation, you've been in those situations. And by the way, this lecture is not just geared for children, it's also geared for adults. And it's really important to know that all of this transcends into any individual, whether they're really young or whether they're adults with Fragile X. We know that when they have to deal with something new, novel, it's very difficult. Being late, they hate being late, rushed, etc. Waiting, that is so hard for them. And so many of the individuals with Fragile X that are older or higher function can talk to me about these things in terms of, it's hard. And I get really anxious. I get nervous when I have to wait. I don't like being late. I don't like walking in to my classroom late because mom was late getting me to school. The noisy, crowded environments, for sure. We know that they don't do well in any place that's noisy, like a gymnasium, like going into maybe a sports event. Those things are difficult. And also anything that's unpredictable, especially social settings. Giving eye contact, immediately you're going to have a response that most likely will be negative because those are so hard for these individuals. Those are those states that are created that they have to deal with. Flying, driving, oftentimes that's difficult as well. Now, this I want to show you because we just talked about going into a loud, crowded gymnasium and how that would affect an individual with Fragile X. This is a young man who's in what we call, well, actually, he's in high school now, and he's on my caseload. And mom was really happy to share this video with you because she wanted to explain that she came up, she thought, with a really good solution, shared it with the teacher. The teacher was on board. This guy is getting an award. And we knew this was going to be really difficult for him. I know he has long hair and is beautiful, but this behind the scenes here in the front is a young man. And he wanted to get this award, but we also knew this was going to be so hard. So there's that approach avoidance, right? He really wants it. He wants to be in with his friends and peers, but he knows that it's going to be very difficult for him to attend. So they worked it out. And he's sitting with the door open. It's still pretty loud, but he's listening to his name being called, and you can see how it went. You can tell he's anxious.
Small door. I'll see you. That's me.
They just called his name.
It's you.
This morning.
Do you want to go see?
I could tell.
And we knew he didn't want to go, but we gave him the option.
Mommy.
Do you want to go?
I don't know.
You can wheel in.
I don't really.
Okay. You don't have to. Give me hugs.
Oh, yeah.
So again, really nice creation here in terms of how do you create a response to this environment that's so difficult for this young man, but still feel that he was a part of it. And I think this was really good thinking on the part of his mom and the teaching staff, because had we wheeled him in or forced him to go in, he would have had a meltdown. He would have been embarrassed. And instead of feeling joy as he is right now, because that's me, and getting the award, he would have been embarrassed and it would have been an awful situation. So again, just learning how to structure those response patterns to the environment. Again, some more situations or states that can intensify and cause problems. We know that the personnel changes for these individuals is very difficult. Oftentimes we have that, don't we? It's really hard to keep a consistent staff in place, at least it is here in the States. And part of that is just, it's a tough job. And also the pay is not really very good for those individuals. And so there's lots of changes, or even a schedule changes in a day. Going through a typical day, we can have lots of different changes. Transitions, and I always tell people, try to limit the transitions if you can. It's very hard for individuals to make that transition. Inconsistent responses from those of us who are caring for these people related to their behavioral episodes. One of us may respond in sort of, we're going to ignore it. Another person may respond with a yell, a scream. Another person may have a specific sort of way that they try to deal with this behavior. It's all of that inconsistency that really causes that anxiety to intensify. Conflict, this is a big one. They perceive conflict, and a lot of times it's not perceived correctly, but it has to do with anybody who might raise their voice, who might have some emotional exchanges with another individual in the classroom or in the community if you have an adult. Those things are perceived as major conflicts, as fights, as yelling, as something very, very difficult to deal with. And so those emotional exchanges that may really just be that can be perceived as a conflict and make these individuals very, very anxious. Intimidated staff member. Now, this comes up a lot, and it can be parents, it can be me. Individuals who respond to, let's say, a behavioral episode that really is caused by the anxiety, but we may respond in a way that kind of we're afraid. Maybe if they've hit us before, maybe if they've bitten us before. And again, that's that fight or flight. When they're in a situation that they can't handle, if they have to get out of there, they're going to fight. And they're going to fight to preserve their own organism. I mean, this is how deep this goes. It's primal. And so again, we have to know how to respond to that and not be intimidated, because they're looking at us as the agent of help, aren't they? They're looking at us as the person that's going to help them get through this. Now, if we're very intimidated by that and afraid, and we're showing our anxiety, that is no help to them. And this is easier said than done, I certainly understand. If you give too much verbal input, that also will cause them to become very anxious. And a lot of times it's happening while they're having a behavioral episode. And again, we just keep putting on more and more verbal input to try to help them get through it. And that's probably the worst thing that we could do. So let's look at an example of this. This is an episode, a behavioral episode. This individual is anxious. He doesn't want to get out of the car, even though it's something that he normally likes. It's that transition. It's leaving the car. It's what am I going to see on the other side? So again, let's just see how this looks.
Come on, Michael, get out.
Sorry. So do I seal these?
Get a fucking paw. Huh?
Stop, Sue.
Come on, I'll help you get out.
No.
Huh? Come on.
Sorry. Oh, that when you have to use.
They're cooking hamburgers.
Oh, I'm false. I'm
You want to ride the bulldozer?
You fucky shit. Fucky shit.
I apologize
chair
for
up
the
there for you.
profanity, but it does tell you what's
Get your
going on with
hands
this
out of the
individual.
Coke.
He is
fine.
really anxious
Please.
about getting out of the car. And we've all done this. We've tried to kind of coerce and cajole and kind of come up with ideas that might enhance the experience and get him out of the car. You know, we can do this, we're cooking hamburgers, whatever. And really all it's doing is adding to his anxiety, because he's already here and now we're pulling in a little bit more, and it's just making him explode. So again, that verbal input, when somebody's going through an episode like this, we need to pull back, we need to say less, and we need to give him an opportunity to move when he can. Now, there's nothing in the car that can actually hurt him. The keys are gone. It might be a situation where if you walked away, he might come out because of the car, because at that point, he'll have a chance to regulate a little bit without the input, and he can then make that decision to leave the car. So let's talk about transitions. I talk about that a lot, but it really does trigger that state, right? It's the state anxiety. It's the situation where they have had to leave one environment and go into another, or one activity and into another. This is really important because when I studied this many years ago and did a dissertation on Fragile X behavior compared to those with autism spectrum that didn't have Fragile X, one of the things that came out in this particular study that I did for my dissertation was that they have a strong reaction to change. So the transition piece is a big piece of that. The change, the schedule, the personnel, the environment. This is really, really difficult for these individuals, and more difficult for them than the individuals that have autism spectrum and don't have Fragile X. So statistically significant in the Fragile X population, far above what we saw in those with autism spectrum. And when we think of individuals with autism spectrum, we think of those people that have trouble with those transition changes, etc. So again, remember, this is really, really critical. And so we want to make sure that we remember that. We want to make sure that we might lessen the transitions, reduce them in the day, in the community, in a job, in a placement where this person may be working and doing a really good job, but then we introduce more and more things for that person to do, or that person has to leave an environment and go into another one, and that's just difficult. Now, it's not to say they can't learn to do that, but you would expect that to be difficult, and it might really cause some behavioral episodes. So we want those protocols to be in place. We want to communicate, okay, when it is transition time, we want to make sure that we talk about transitional objects, jobs on that in that process, so that they can cross that threshold and do okay. We also introduced the question mark that I've talked to many of you about in social stories, in your daily schedule. And that question mark really summons a change, so they get to know what that means. And we've got a slide for that later. So again, navigating, finding different places in the environment. I have a lot of females with Fragile X, which we will definitely talk more about in another lecture. You know that we won't leave the girls out. They have a lot of trouble navigating. They have a lot of trouble finding places. Garmin's were great. Now the phones are doing really well, helping them learn to navigate and get around. They may even get lost in a school because it's so big and they can't find the next room, and it's very difficult for them, makes them so anxious. Leaving the house, some of them are agoraphobic. They will not leave the house because they're so afraid of what's out in that environment, that state that's out there. Making a mistake. And I think this is really, really critical. I don't think we think about this enough. The people with Fragile X that I know and have worked with for many, many years have this great sense of pleasing others and wanting to do right. That is really in their core. And when they make a mistake or they become embarrassed, it's really hard for them to rectify that, to reconcile that. And so oftentimes they become so anxious about making that mistake or being embarrassed that the behavioral episodes ensue. And so we want to really remember that. And it's really important for us to repair that situation as best we can, because it's so hard for them. Being rushed, difficult. They feel like, their heart's racing and they're trying to kind of get somewhere, and that causes them to become over anxious. Public speaking, anytime they're in front of a crowd, reading in front of a group of kids at school, being in front of people at work, this is difficult for them. And I have a person that I'm seeing right now who's on a job rotation, an adult with Fragile X, and his job is learning to greet the receptionist every day when he goes into work. And it's changing because it's a rotation. They're trying to figure out what's the best placement for him. That is difficult for him to do. He becomes very anxious. And what does he do? Puts on his headsets and runs off as fast as he can, because he's avoiding that anxiety, that thing, that interaction that causes him to get really anxious. So what's the big deal, you might say, about anxiety? We're all anxious. I've been anxious at times, and mom and dads, you've been anxious, caregivers. Well, it's tricky because anxiety sort of sneaks up on us, doesn't it? And sometimes it kind of hides behind us. It doesn't come out. We can sort of mask it, I guess is what we could say. But it also, in people with Fragile X, can rule them. It can be such a big part of their lives that it overtakes their well-being. And when we diagnose anxiety in our diagnostic manual, it has to be a behavior, a trait that has in fact overcome someone for at least 6 months and interferes with their functioning. So that's important to remember, because these individuals may actually meet the criteria for anxiety early on. So they've had this for a long, long time. It takes over. They get so angry about it. They tell me they can't stand the feeling and they want to try to control it or get rid of it because it's always there gnawing at them. So when it comes in small packages, it's kind of a motivator. I mean, we got to get this done. I'm a little anxious about it, but it motivates me to get something done. But when it mushrooms, it can be overwhelming and consuming. And this is what individuals with Fragile X share with me often. It becomes so difficult and it's overwhelming, takes over their life. It grows into panic attacks, sometimes feel like they're choking, having a heart attack. We've got that impulse going, and a lot of times their heart rate is going up. It causes us to be so afraid that they avoid activities like flying and driving, answering a phone call, or being in a crowd. So again, this information is critical. And the reason we're saying it causes us to do these things is that this information is coming directly from individuals with Fragile X. So this is really the truth of the package, isn't it? This is really so important because they've shared this with us. It can cause them to get stuck and not be able to think properly. Those of you that have had anxiety know what that's like. You freeze. You can't introduce your best friend that's right next to you in a crowd because you're stuck. And with individuals with Fragile X, they kind of get so stuck that they perseverate. And that's all they're thinking about. And that comes out in their speech, their language. They say the same thing over and over again. But if you listen to that, you can kind of glean what's causing them to be afraid or causing them to be so anxious. She came in today, and I can't believe she came in today. She came into my house and she kept asking and looking at me. She came into my house. So again, that's the kind of thing that you hear sometimes in terms of the perseverative language. And now we can pick up the clue. Was it this person came in, didn't give them a clue that they were coming, came into the house, whatever it was, you can now backtrack that, fast forward, and get to a solution that's going to be a good strategy. So I hope today you will learn a little bit better about this anxiety and understanding how it really impacts these individuals and give you strategies that can help, whether you have a very, very young child, a toddler with Fragile X, female, male, or you have somebody in high school, in middle school, going through elementary school, or you have an adult who is in a placement or in a facility that you maybe work in, or even a job situation. So again, hoping this will kind of get you to an idea to better understand what this is like for these individuals. So the big deal is when we look at anxiety, now this is an old DSM-4, we use the 5 now, DSM-5, for anxiety, but there are certain criteria, kind of a checklist that you have to make in order to deem or to call this person anxious. So again, it's just basically giving the diagnosis based on a checklist. So you look at this and you're going to see that the black actually meets the criteria. So they meet the 6 out of 8 or whatever they need to meet in terms of the diagnostic criteria. The white actually shows they have the features, but not enough to meet the diagnostic criteria. So again, look at this. I mean, it's pretty amazing. This is a number of 58 of people with Fragile X. And this is all about males. This one is about males. So again, 58 of them from the ages of 5 to 26. You can look at the fact that, yeah, separation anxiety is a big deal, maybe not quite as big as some of the others. Social phobia, absolutely. And these guys will have that feature for sure. It's very hard for them to be in a crowd. It's very hard for them to introduce themselves. It's very hard for them to see a new person and be able to respond. Then specific phobias. So phobias about flying, driving, those kinds of things, traveling, whatever. Those are specific. Some of us would say snakes and spiders, but to these guys, it's a much bigger issue than just a snake or a spider. They may have that problem too, but it's more about leaving the house. It's more about traveling. It's more about flying. Agoraphobia, now that is leaving the house. You can see that there's a pretty good 40%. That's quite a few that have the features. And then panic. A lot of my female clients have panic disorders and are treated for that through medication, and then some different strategies that we use in therapy. Generalized anxiety, just overall, okay, overall meeting that criteria. Many also. Now, this is OCD, which is kind of something that comes under the umbrella of anxiety. So obsessive compulsive disorder, it's wanting things to be the same all the time. It's wanting things to be in place all the time. That's another one that is a big deal to this population. PTSD, and then also selective mutism. So many of the girls, not many, but the girls tend to have selective mutism, and that's something that is very difficult for them to overcome. The two big winners here, if we want to call them winners, is the social phobia and the specific phobia. So again, those are things at over 80%. 85 in terms of specific phobias about being afraid to travel, being afraid to drive, being afraid to fly, being afraid to go to grandma's house today, whatever it is. Those things are really a big deal. So it's a huge issue with this population. What happens when they're anxious? Sometimes there's some behavioral things that happen. Now, we're not just talking about the neurology of this situation, like the brain that we saw, but we're also talking now behavioral sort of issues. Hypervigilance, looking around all the time, trying to figure out where we are. And then we're trying to get them to give us eye contact, and they're so worried about their environment and who's there and who's behind them and what's going on. So that's something that they do often. And that helps them sort of feel like they're in control. The heart rate we talked about, sometimes cluttered and fast speech. So when you hear your child, your adult, the person in your school, whoever you're caring for, sort of start to talk fast and clutter their speech, that might be sort of a precursor to them trying to say to you, I'm anxious. I need some calm. I need to be away from this environment. When the speech gets tangential, they can't follow a conversation and they're not having a common conversation that makes much sense, just kind of look at that as one of the precursors. Sometimes they start to walk fast pace, and sometimes they close their eyes or avert their gaze. It's sort of their way of bringing it all in and trying to get control of that environment. Sometimes they yell, they curse, they lash out verbally. And these are people that normally are just fine, just have no problem at all. Fun to be around. I had a guy the other day telling me on my telehealth episode, when I brought something up that he didn't want to talk about, that I was getting into his business and I needed to get out of his business. It was his business and he didn't need me making rules. So again, that kind of gave me the idea, this is really walking. I better have to tread lightly here, because he is getting very anxious about hearing this rule change. And maybe I need to present it to him a different way. Sometimes aggressive, they do, and they become destructive. Sometimes they put holes in walls. When they get embarrassed, then they try to avoid. And it's really hard to re-engage them in some sort of conversation about, you know what, this wasn't a big deal. You didn't make a really bad mistake. But once they've crossed that threshold and they really feel embarrassed, it's hard to come back. The social shyness, yeah, tough for them for sure. And they're going to become even more shy. The girls especially, they're going to hide behind, their mom when they're young, and then they're going to hide behind, the phones. They're not going to answer their phones. They're going to let it go to voicemail. They're not going to return calls. They're not going to initiate calls. That social shyness really is difficult. Self-abuse, a lot of times biting that hand, head hitting, and some picking at scabs. Mumbling, name calling, those are sort of some of the behavioral responses. So again, repeating things, sometimes overeating, sometimes staying home, not wanting to go anywhere. That's that agoraphobia. If that's happening and you have an adult or a young child with Fragile X, I say get in there right away, because when we think of anxiety and how it can control the life of others with Fragile X, when they become agoraphobic, all bets are off, because they can't participate in anything. They can't go to work. They can't have a normal life. So let's be really sure that we identify that early on and start strategies to try to get them to take those baby steps to get out of the house and do things. Sometimes they spend a lot. Sometimes they obviously look away from the speaker. They choose not to answer the phone, as I said before, or make those calls. A lot of times I'll see them, and I allow them in my office to have fidgets, because that's important for them to deal with, and it's a nice strategy for them to employ. I like to encourage that. However, sometimes they're looking on the phone, they're trying to text, whatever. When we're trying to have a group activity, or maybe we're having a social activity, I always ask them to put that phone away. It's a way for them to kind of respond when they're anxious, but it's really important for them not to get that out and be distracted. So again, in any of the texting that they may do, or any of the Googling that they might be doing, they become cranky, irritable. They do sometimes, and I really feel like these individuals do not lie. It's not like something that they tend to do on purpose. It's simply a response. It's a behavioral response to that anxiety that's overwhelming. And in order to deal with that, they often may tell, I don't remember that, or I didn't do that, or I don't remember is a big one, or they make excuses. And again, that's their behavioral response. And it only continues if it's reinforced. Remember, a behavior does not continue unless it's reinforced. And when they do this and people don't call them on it or say, what was really going on? I had an opportunity to talk to your mom, and she mentioned that it was, you really weren't sick, but that you were anxious. Now, that's important, because I don't want that individual with Fragile X to think that I don't believe them when they're trying to give me an excuse. The excuse is around, I was too anxious. I needed to avoid it. That is pay dirt. When we can hit that, and they can actually say that instead of I was sick, which would have been a lie, and maybe we could stretch it to say they probably were sick to their stomach or something else because they're so anxious. But I think we have to now start to frame that for them and say, I understand why you said you were sick. You really were trying to avoid this activity, and you were anxious and you were avoiding. Let's talk about that. Obsessions, sometimes they just get stuck on something and they can't get off it. The picking of the skin, picking at scabs. And then oftentimes, and I see this in males and females, they start laughing, and they're really inappropriate, because that's the way they cope. That's the way they deal with it. And it could even be neurobiological. It could be something that's going on physiologically that causes them to laugh. So that looks kind of funny in a situation when they've had an anxious episode and then they start laughing. For example, let's say when they're talking to you about something that's really hard to talk about, and all of a sudden they sort of start giggling. A lot of times the girls will do that. That's a mixed message, isn't it? So it's like they're talking about what made them anxious, but then suddenly they start to giggle and laugh. So again, that's something that needs to be confronted in a way that makes sense. You have to give them the idea that their anxiety is a big deal. It's not an excuse. It's truly part of their chemistry, part of their neurobiology, and they need to understand that because of that, they're just trying to survive. They're just trying to live. And so they come up with their own ideas, and some of them are very maladaptive. I always say they tell you what they need, and our job now is to make that better for them. Headaches, these are physical things that happen. Stomach problems, this is all taken from those individuals we've surveyed. They gain weight, they may lose weight, they sleep more, they sleep less. Some trouble breathing. Oftentimes you'll hear that from them. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Well, of course, they're probably starting a panic attack. Chest, they worry about having a heart attack at times, or it just bothers them and they can't label it. Swallowing, sometimes we'll just give them a drink of water and that'll help. cramping, muscle cramping, sweating, and the fast heart rate. And this has been studied where they've actually tracked in situations where people feel very anxious, and they've kind of created that state anxiety, and then they've tracked the heart rate and it goes up. So this is something that is not just something we're making up for the sake of this is a good excuse. It's truly part of their neurobiology. Now, when we have trait and state come together, it really produces a lot of fear. So we can have those traits that are there and in the brain. And if we're kind of calming the waters and the state isn't too bad, we can deal with that, right? And the individuals with Fragile X can deal with it. But what happens when those two come together? It creates tremendous fear. And I really want to stress this today, because I think when I've talked about anxiety in the past, I may not have made it as clear that this really causes fear at a primal level. It's a level that brings on a fight or flight to preserve that person. Not to say that that person can tell you, I'm going to die because of this, or I'm going to, be hurt because of this. But that's what they're really feeling without verbalizing it. It's like that organism is being attacked, and I have to figure out a way to fix it. So again, this is really a primal response. We go back to this fight or flight. We either have to fight it or we have to get out of there. It's too hard for me to understand how I'm going to survive this. Okay, so this is really interesting. This is by Walter Cannon, and he talked about the fight or flight response. Has nothing to do with Fragile X. It was just about the normal, typical population, right? But he was talking about how anxiety can take on that fight or flight. And I love how he talks about it, because it merges very clearly with what we know about the brain and those individuals with Fragile X and the lack of protein and what it does to the brain. So again, that biochemical change that prepares our body for that threat, that danger. And that response gives our body quick bursts of energy sometimes. Sometimes we feel like we need to fight something. We need to flee from a situation. I mean, if we're being attacked by someone, we're going to fight back or we're going to run away. That's what he's talking about. And that burst of energy that comes over us all the way up our central nervous system. This amygdala, and I put this slide back in so we can talk about that. That's part of that primitive brain that was there at this develops from the cortex is here. The brainstem develops from down here up. And these are sort of higher functions, okay? But this is the primitive part of the brain right here. So that means that primal response, alive and well. And it is involved in survival. And that's exactly what this is about. Not to be overly dramatic, but these individuals wonder if they're going to survive this. So any real or imagined threats that can cause this to happen in the cortex sends the alarm to the hypothalamus. And we don't have a picture of that, but that's exactly what goes on. And that then stimulates the nervous system. It changes your body so that heart rate starts to go, that breathing rate starts to go, the muscle tension is there, the metabolism and blood pressure increase. And that's why we can track it so easily. All we have to do is look at the heart rate, take the blood pressure, and we know what's going on physiologically because of this fear. So the blood is directed to large muscles so you can fight. I mean, it's all set up in this organism to protect you. And that's why your hands can get cold, sometimes even clammy. You have butterflies in your stomach, your diaphragm locks up and your pupils dilate. So this guy has studied really the biochemical changes in those individuals, with any individual, when they're anxious. And this is the fight or flight. I love how it merges just perfectly with the research that we've done on individuals with Fragile X. So it may be that fight response is they're going to hit you. They're going to hit someone else. They may get destructive. They may throw things. They may tear things up, put holes in walls, curse you, call you names. That's a fight response. And posturing, a lot of times posturing and making, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to chop your neck off. Those are ways that fight response kicks in. Then the flight, and you can see what happens. They are trying to avoid this situation. It's very difficult. So the hand covers the face, and they're hoping that they can flee, meaning I don't have to deal with this anymore. Physically, they might remove themselves, but it's not always just physically. They might avoid by kind of figuring out some very sophisticated methods, talking about something that's interesting, or may change the subject. That's a way to flee. That's a way to get out of that situation that's uncomfortable. Excuses, being too tired, putting their head down on a desk, those kinds of things. Or they may revert to that funny sense of humor. They have wonderful sense of humor. So that funny side now can come about, and that makes you laugh, and it kind of gets you off track, doesn't it? What can we do when this happens? We've got to have some strategies to help in this situation, because it's a huge part of their everyday life. We have to structure that environment to account for anxiety and control that state anxiety. And I've talked about this many times. When we've looked at kind of those triggers, antecedents, what can we do to that environment to provide less opportunities for this person with Fragile X to become anxious? Well, we can give the student or the worker in a working situation the opportunity to choose the order of the tasks. If it doesn't matter, having a little control and being able to choose is really huge in terms of reducing the effects of anxiety. So again, we want to do that. If it doesn't matter which one of these things they do first, put that on their schedule. They can make maybe you have to do this part, and then they can choose what order of their breaks they want, what they want to do when they have their 3 breaks during the day. What do you want to do during your break? Also, a lot of good strategies for organization, putting things away, putting things in order. That's kind of that OCD component that they would probably feel pretty comfortable with if they could provide that to themselves. We can say, you know, how about doing this? And those obsessive habits really become sort of calming. So again, this is something that you can do, is have them do an activity that they know how to do, but just to let them know, you know what, I really need some help. I've got so much silverware here to put away. Could you please put this away? That then ramps it down a little bit in terms of the anxiety, gives them a chance to kind of calm down. And it works very well. Predictability, let's get that schedule going. Let's get the visuals in place so that they can follow those schedules with great predictability. This is the question mark I talked to you about earlier. When there is a change, which is a big trigger, use that question mark to signal that change in either personnel, in routine, in schedule, etc. And you teach them this so that they know when that question mark comes up, that they know something is going to change. There's going to be something different to either the personnel or their day, their schedule, and then they're ready for it. So when they're looking at their schedule, they'll go right to that question mark and they'll say, oh, wait a minute, we have a change. Yep, you sure do. And it's going to be this. And sometimes I just flip it up and I have the change underneath with maybe a picture or somebody's name or whatever we need to do at that particular time. Be sure that you're using visual supports for breaks, alternative activities to kind of self-regulate. That's something that we can for sure teach. We can teach some breathing, and I'll show that in a minute. Modeling in terms of the calming. Just make sure that we are helping them learn strategies so that when they become anxious, because it's going to happen all the time, they know what to do about it. And just knowing and having a strategy that works will be calming in and of itself. We love using the tokens. That is really helpful for these guys. And again, when they look at this, they know exactly what's going to be expected of them, how many tasks they need to complete to get to the end. And that's very calming to be able to mark off. I did that. Okay, now I'm going to do this. I did that. So again, any of that sort of way to predict how much that you're going to expect out of them, that's going to help reduce that anxiety. This again, using these visuals and protocols. We're going to do this first, and then you get reinforced with the computer. We can use this even at home, waking up and using the bathroom and eating, etc., and then being ready for school. And I often tell my parents when I hand these out, give them lots of schedules to use at home. You know, this is really critical, because if we go through all these steps and your child or even your adult knows he's going to work after this, they know what's happening, what's coming next, and their day goes so much better. Again, visual schedules. We've talked about this a lot. I can't talk about it enough, really, because it works so well. Structure the environment. We're going to do this and this and this. This is another one that we can put up in terms of behavioral episodes. If you hit, then we can't have the screen time. And again, this is something that we can post. We don't have to make a big deal out of it. We can just even point. We can use tokens to get to this point, whatever works. This is kind of hard to see, but this is exactly what she's doing on her way home from school. I like this one because it really helps kind of structure the environment in a way to predict what's coming, but wrapping up in this structure and in this schedule is therapy. This is something that we did when we went to lunch. This little guy was going into a huge lunchroom that really was difficult for him to deal with, the noise and everything else, but we were trying to get him included. And we had him working and eating in the special ed classroom, and he really wanted to be a part of what was going on. So we brought him into the cafeteria for a few minutes, and that was enough. But we started to get him gradually desensitized. So before, we had him carrying heavy work into that particular cafeteria. He brought in this case, this is just a little schematic here. He brought in all of the lunch boxes that individuals who were bringing lunch, and they were pretty heavy, and he had them in a little wagon, and he'd bring it into the lunchroom. That gave him a special job, which helped calm him down, gave him the transitional object job, and it also gave him heavy work. So it killed 3 birds with 1 stone beautifully. During the time that he was there, he did use the noise canceling headphones, and we got special permission for him to listen to music. And then afterwards, he finished, he did really well. He went into the OT lab, and he had some really good deep breathing and some sort of debriefing, really, in terms of that situation. And now he does it really well. It's just part of his routine. So again, now, how do you structure it? A lot of times with social anxiety, we have to give them the headsets. We have to help them navigate and get to where they're going, maybe wearing sunglasses. Any of that is a way to help sort of reduce that anxiety. We definitely teach the deep breathing. We teach with props, so that you can really look at a flower, bring in an artificial flower and have them start to smell. And then you can have the candle. I often don't light the candle, but you can blow it out. Again, this is a nice way to kind of give them those props so that they understand what you're talking about. Take a deep breath. That could mean a number of things to anybody, but if you're really smelling a really wonderful flower, get it all in, get all that goodness in, and now let's blow out that candle. Wait a minute, you didn't blow hard enough. Try it again. So again, you can kind of use that. You can do a calm down routine where they're sitting on the floor and they're taking their deep breaths. You can help with 5 deep breaths and use kind of the counter that we did before with the tokens. Trying to figure out a calming that sort of gives them a chance to explain what their feelings are and how that works, so they identify those feelings. Again, I'm really angry, down to I'm happy. So there is kind of this sense of how angry, how upset they are, and they can start to identify that. Also, feelings. A lot of times they don't know how to identify those feelings. So if we start to give them an idea of pairing that behavior with this feeling, like I said earlier, when somebody said they're sick, they really weren't sick, they were anxious, and they didn't want the social situation. So there we can pair the anxiety that's going on with what they're calling sick. And this happens a lot. So again, getting them to identify these feelings is really, really important. And it honestly can be as simple as they're hungry. And so they're agitated. They're not even anxious at that point. I like this one because it helps us identify just how, in terms of sort of a gradation, how anxious they are. They can look at dice and know that at the number 1, if they're not real good with numerals, this does kind of show you've got different colors here. So there's a difference. You can see that we kind of like blue for calming oftentimes. And then red is very anxious. You can see that this is less than this. This is less than this. So it gives a visual representation, not only with the dots, but also with the colors. And then you can also see with these emojis that they're very used to. And then they can identify. how big that feeling is, the size of that feeling. So a lot of times when I'm doing therapy with individuals, I'll talk about something that the parents have brought to my attention through emails or whatever way of, giving me a message on a phone. And then I can talk about that episode and I can say, what was going on at that time? What was that feeling like when the repairman came to the door and you were by yourself and you didn't know what to do? So again, we can kind of talk about that. Again, this is the thermometer, the feeling thermometer. Again, sort of like this one, just a little bit more involved and a little bit more complicated. When we don't control that environment, a lot of our worries just get bigger and bigger. And so we shift attention to another idea or activity to try to interrupt that worry cycle. A lot of times the girls will bring that in and that's all they want to talk about. Because our brain decides that you're no longer in danger, and your brain can stop sending those emergency signals to your brain when we want to, flee. So again, I tell them about this, and I tell them, again, this is another prop of blowing the bubbles. Instead of blowing out the candle, you can blow bubbles, but I help them understand that their brain is sending a signal to their body, and their body is on the high alert. And now let's try to calm that down. But what happens when we think we've got it all covered? We know that we've got the environment in good place. We've used the visual schedules. We've got everything in place for that state anxiety to be at a bare minimum. We know we can't control a whole bunch of what's going on with the trait anxiety, maybe some medication, maybe some of that kind of thing. But for the most part, the state is what we can really manipulate and help with this process. But in comes the wild card. And I always talk about this as something that we think we've got it covered, but we really don't. The wild card is how we respond. Okay, so we've got it all covered. We think it's going to go well, and it doesn't. And we then become the wild card. It's our response to that situation. Sometimes we're pretty mad about it because we've worked really hard to make this a good situation and it explodes. So we want to think about what's our response, okay? We really have to take a look at that so that we can make or break that outcome. A lot of it rests on us. Now, this isn't in every case because a lot of times it goes perfectly well. But I'm talking about those times that you would predict it's going to go well, and even it went well yesterday. But that trait, that neurobiology is working against us a little bit, and we don't know exactly how, because we can't get into the brain to figure that out. So we have to be the calming agent. Let's think about our tone of voice in that setting. Let's think about our frustration level, because, hey, we're human. And I want all of you to know out there that are caregivers, parents, teachers, etc., you are the heroes of this, and you have so much power to help this individual get through a very difficult situation. When it doesn't work, we own that. We own that because we want it to go well. So we become really frustrated and we want to know, how can we handle this better? Why did we fail? We feel the failure because the child is, or the adult is having difficulty. So take a break if your tension gets pretty high. Know how to tag team. Know that you're going to turn this over to someone else, your partner. Maybe it's somebody in the work environment that's a colleague. Let's go ahead and take that break and kind of do the tag teaming, because then we cut down that response, that wild card response, and somebody else is in there that's brand new to the situation. Acknowledge what you did. Maybe there was something that you just didn't think through. Maybe there was something that when you reacted, it just elevated everything. Understand, this will not be the only time the plan goes bad. There'll be other opportunities to put this into place. And then salvage any positive outcome, because it didn't all go bad. You did some good planning. There's just a piece of that you either needed to plan for better, or you contributed because it just surprised you so much. So again, just salvage any positive. And there's always a positive out of anything that goes with this population, especially when they have good caregivers and parents. So in conclusion, I just want to share with you, again, this trait, neurobiological response, bringing on this anxiety. It's all the hardwiring in the brain. It's what they inherit because they don't produce that protein, that lack of protein. The environmental conditions and responses and expectations is that state anxiety that contribute to the outcome. Those episodes that you are experiencing are caused by a reaction of that person with Fragile X to that state, to that environment, and that many behaviors are difficult to handle, really stem from this paradigm, from being anxious. I want to thank you all for being with me today. It's been a joy, a pleasure. I know we're going to do some question and answers, and I'll be happy to sort of sort through some of those experiences that you've had with your children, the caregivers, with your clients with Fragile X syndrome.